Welcome to another exciting episode of Barbershop Talk. And today we're going to continue celebrating Black History Month. And as you know, February is dedicated as Black History Month, honoring the triumphs and struggles of African Americans throughout the US history, including civil rights movements and their artistic, cultural, and political achievements. Today we have with us Mr. Christopher Martin Stansel, and he is the Sheikh and Divine Minister, Assistant Grand Sheikh of Moorish Science Temple of America Branch, Temple number 11, Syracuse. Mr. Martin, welcome. Nice to see you again.
Oh man, it's a blessing. Good to be seen, brother, and it's good to be amongst you, man. And I praise God for this opportunity, and I give honors to you and what you're doing, man. It's a blessing to be here to unfold with you, brother. And honors to everything that you're doing right now. That's what's up, brother. It's powerful, especially for our people.
Thank you, man. As you know, we wanted to give some our viewers some more insightful picture of not only the historians and the achievers in America, but we want to branch off a little bit and go down to like in the Caribbean region, Africa, all these other countries that we don't really talk much about. But we have something different today. I hear you have a nice topic to talk about. What do you want to talk about today for Black History Month?
Um, the origins of the transatlantic slave trade and a lot of the misconceptions to address as far as different perspectives on where did this transatlantic slave trade start,
Mm-hmm.
and our connection to it as far as who we are as a people. And I like that you brought up, going around the different areas of the diaspora and knowing that all of these people are interconnected and our forefathers did great things as far as to help support the advancement of Western civilization. And that is directly connected to what I'm going to display today. So, as noted, I serve as a Sheikh and Divine Minister of the Moorish Science Temple of America, Assistant Grand Sheikh of the Moorish Science Temple of America Branch, Temple number 11 in Syracuse, New York. And I'm from Rochester originally. And I went to school, studied undergraduate at Hampton University, where I studied history, and I did an undergraduate thesis on the survey of the global Moorish Holocaust. Now, this was a survey of the eradication of the Moors on a global scale. And this is absolutely the target of what's focused on is the Middle Passage or the transatlantic slave trade and what some of the things I'm going to be sharing today. So I'm going to, if I could, share my screen.
Yeah.
I could share it so I could get into it because it's not too. It's a lot to go through. But if you could can you allow to share it, or is it say if you go to the settings, it should. So, true origins of the transatlantic slave trade. This is a presentation we give at our branch temple. Um, so, we talking about slavery existing in multiple forms. We're familiar with the chattel slavery here in America. Um, Chattel slavery is where the slave is sole property of the owner, has long existed in the Nile Valley in North Africa. But this concept was learned and used here in the Americas, and then this is what they were free from in 1865. But the target of the transatlantic slave trade was the Moors, was identified as the Moors. And this is Pope Eugene IV, who issued the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church, who issued the Ilias Q. This is a papal bull, and this serves as the documentation of the origins of the transatlantic slave trade. If you notice where it says this papal bull that licensed the Portuguese raids on the West African coast as a continuance of the Crusades and granted full remission of sins to those that took part in any expedition against the Moors / Saracens. Now, often in Europe during these times, if you see 1383, 14th century around Europe, the Moors were labeled as Saracens, Arabs, or simply as Muslims, or the Moors. So this papal bull developed a mindset that perceived the enslavement of Africans by the Portuguese and later Europeans as a continuation of the Crusades on behalf of Christendom. So this is fully shows the target of the transatlantic slave trade, and the fact that the Pope said that they would be given indulgences, basically like granted full remissions of sins, like how they would pay to go to get into heaven. But and this is a portion from a source, The Atlantic Slave Trade by Professor Nazir Ahmed, PhD, captains. Talks about where it starts right here. If you go down and skip down for the sake of time, it talks about the origins of the slave trade, and it says this was the origin of the slave trade, which began with Portuguese piracy on the Moroccan coast in 1441. So this is just one of the papal bulls that came out in that era of time. The next one was Pope Nicholas V. This was known as the Doctrine of Discovery. And if you want, at a later time, I could send anyone or email them the slides if they want to go review. But this followed up after Ilias Q. If you scroll to the bottom, Ilias Q, Dum Diversus, Romanus Pontifex, and Inter Caratera became the foundation of the Doctrine of Discovery. Now, the popes continued with this line of papal bulls that strategically targeted the Moors and the concept of a manifest destiny in the age of imperialism, that they were under the divine right of God to conduct this transatlantic slave trade. So if you notice where in the writings it said the global slave trade of the 15th and 16th centuries in the age of imperialism, manifest destiny, and the social construct caste system of color code of race, which peaked in the development and the use in America. So this is Pope Nicholas V. This is just some different sources. When we think about the discovery of America, is directly connected to the Moors. If you're familiar with Christopher Columbus's voyage in 1492, this was the same year where the Castile and Aragon family came together with Ferdinand and Isabella getting married. Now, this was known as the New World, or the Second Coming of Christ, because they expelled the Moors and the Jews out of Europe. And this is the beginning of what is known as the Spanish Inquisition, which was a continuation of the onslaught and the Crusades in Western civilization against the Moors, which set up the first European nation state, which is Spain. So the foundation of Spain is connected to the Moors, who ruled Spain for over 700 years. And this when Spain was known as Al-Andalus. So if we know anything about the Christopher Columbus voyage, we know he was an Italian who had his voyage to the Americas funded by Spain. And he actually had a group of Moors known as the Nino brothers who guided him on his way in his journey, because the Moorish Empire had dominions that exceeded across the Atlantic Ocean onto the North, South, Central, and the Atlantis Islands. This is how Columbus was able to translate with the indigenous populations. They had Moorish people who of Moorish descent in those areas, in those lands. So this is from the Atlantic Slave Trade by the author Professor Nazir Ahmed, and he's given a source of the target, the Moors being the target of this slave trade. And he specifically said it is not commonly appreciated that the first target of the slavery in West Africa were the Moors. The Portuguese and the Spanish referred to all Muslim, regardless of racial differences, as Moors. So, a lot of times when we start the story of the diaspora in the American society, I mean, in North America, United States of America, especially in the schools, they started at 1619 Jamestown, when really it's connected to 1492 in the Spanish Inquisition in the 15th century between the Portuguese, the Spaniards, and their onslaught on the Moors. And this is critical in this day and time when people talk about reparations, where the European powers were responsible for over hundreds of years before the inception of the United States to be included within the reparations conversation as far as who was responsible, because you have the Roman Catholic Church, you have the Spanish, you have the Portuguese, you have the English, you have the French. All of these different European powers had their involvement, and they really had their motivation and inspiration come through the Catholic Church. So these are just some different sources that we have, and this is a list of the actual papal bulls and what they, within the documents, what the direction and goal and the objectives of the papal bulls were. So if we look at the Ilias Q, which was discussed, we know that they authorized a special crusade against the Moors, because this is a continuation of the Middle Ages, where one important year, when we think about the change of Constantinople to Istanbul in 1453, when this was the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire. So we look at now that happened, this Ilias Q happened prior to that. So you see this is a continuation of ongoing fighting between Christians and Muslims. Mm-hmm. So the Dum Diversus Nicholas V, 1452, this authorized Alfonso V of Portugal, who was the leader of Portugal at that time, to reduce any Moors, subjects of the Moroccan Empire, non-Christians, to perpetual slavery. And this is prior to any expeditions to America. And this is in the 15th century. Then you had Romanus Pontifex Nicholas V, 1455, extended the Christian nations of Europe dominion over discovered Moorish territories during the Age of Discovery. A lot of people are not aware that the Moorish Empire had a lot of dominions in northwestern and southwestern shores of Africa prior to European exploration, and also across the Atlantic to North, South, Central America and the Atlantis Islands, and also even in Europe. So, a lot of times our people were identified on the high seas as pirates. And this is how to the effects where you'll hear about the Moroccan Treaty of Peace and Friendship with the United States in the early 18th century of 1787, recognizing the independence of the United States. Well, you always had the Moors on the high seas. We were on the high seas into antiquity prior to the European powers even knowing how to build ships. So these are some of the misconceptions to clear up when it comes to the transatlantic slave trade. But this was connected to spirituality and religious systems. This crusade against the Moors trickled down to the denationalization of Moors within the American Constitution, constitutional conventions, where they were known as Moors, but they were stripped of their titles and given the names and labels Negro, Black, Colored, Ethiopian, and a lot of these different names that change up about every 10 years. So I don't know if you had any questions, my brother, but it's a lot of extensive research when it comes to this global Moorish Holocaust and the origins of the transatlantic slave trade.
All right. Cool.
So when you think about the transatlantic slave trade and if we had to put someone on trial, and if they, you had the defendants and they listed the co-defendants, from our perspective, as far as the research and historical record, you have to line up the European powers at that time in the 15th century and on. From the 15th century to, the start of the abolition movement, abolitionist movements in different nations, and you had also colonial independence movement. So when you were speaking about Toussaint L'Ouverture and the Haitian Revolution, what's interesting how race comes into play when it's dealing with um, nations from the Caribbean or South America or Central America. Well, those European powers and the connection that we can't forget about the French. The French is often a deflected topic in American schools outside of the Louisiana Purchase, which
Right.
is connected to that transferring of land and colonial powers from the French to the United States, where you have this large amount of land in these indigenous peoples from these areas who were, being colonized by the French, who have a different experience when it came to the diaspora and the transatlantic slave trade in comparison to those who were colonized by the British.
Mm-hmm.
And you can even see that in the language and that they speak as far as the Creole.
Mm-hmm.
And their perspectives as far as when it comes to slaveholders and their relationships in those Louisiana territory. But we know as far as when you think about Toussaint L'Ouverture, and one thing to note about him is being a Haitian general. Well, at the time, if you think about it, if Haitian had a military, they were organized, and the general is not the highest position in the military. The president is. So that lets me to think that they had their own government going on. So it's some things that if you do the research and look into that are real already, as far as what they revolted against the French, they were organized. And that was key if you think about Toussaint L'Ouverture serving as a model for these independence movements that took place in the 19th and in the 20th centuries. So it's definitely give honors to the brother Toussaint L'Ouverture, because he was that prominent leader in the Haitian Revolution, and Haiti was seen as the first free so-called black state. But you see how racial norms and the color code classification system takes effect on the psychology of the people,
Oh yeah.
where this label that's given to slaveholders will identify a whole people rather than just saying, well, they're Haitian.
Right.
Oh, well, no, that's black. Well, why? Because they look, but then, right across the way, you got the Dominican Republic that was colonized by the Spanish. And then you have this beef, but they're on the same island. Then you're like, hold up, but it's a difference. But it's a difference because of the experience. Well, the forefathers are shared. And then that's where that's a tough conversation for people to have. But if you do the history between the Moors, that makes us all interconnected. I don't care what island you're from.
Right.
Because if you think about the European, they were bringing Moors from Europe to these islands and to the Americas, not all the way from Africa. We were already in Europe. That's the secret. A lot of the secrets in the global history and the thought process about it is, our forefathers cannot be circumscribed. And, it sounds kind of cocky, like we, to have a sense of humility about it. When your forefathers are the mothers and fathers of the human family, a lot of people might take that as, whoa, what do you mean? Well, what about this? What about that? But when you start studying our people, that's when, stuff start getting spiritual, because you're talking about stuff that's 6,000, 10,000 years old. And historians really don't feel comfortable discussing certain things like that unless you're doing like stuff with evidence and archaeology and really getting into some deep studies and digging.
Right. So Toussaint, when he led the revolution, he made way for a lot of other countries in that region that were traveled fast with the slaves. And I was reading something where the actual slave that met Toussaint before the revolution was slave from Jamaica. I can't remember his name. It's in the book somewhere, but he's the one that kind of tell Toussaint what was going on in the island of Jamaica, and that's when Toussaint said, "Man, enough is enough. We really got to do something." And then he started the revolution right there, but which gave way to a lot of uprisings right there in Jamaica as well. Nanny of the Maroon, she was a fierce warrior, man. She after the revolution, she was a little rebel herself in the island, and she killed a lot of British soldiers, ambushed them in the bushes. You know, they didn't have any modern weapons, but they used the forestry as a means of camouflage and a battlefield. Where that fight, I think, went on for almost 5, 7 years before they eventually caught up to her and killed her. But after that, you can just see how powerful Tucson is in this whole uprise, if you want to call it, for a lot of countries in the region to actually break free from the chains and the years and years of abuse and neglect and all that, and try to make way for their people.
Yeah, and I concur with that thought, brother. And even thinking about when you mentioned the uprisings in Jamaica, and even towards the British and the uprisings in Haiti towards the French, it made me think about how with the indigenous cultures, like you brought up the Maroons.
Hmm.
One thing etymologically that's connected is if you talk with the indigenous people of you have an indigenous group of people in Haiti that were known as the Marabouts.
Mm.
If you look at, but a lot of times, if you look etymologically, the Maroons and the Maro and the Moro go back to the Moors.
Okay.
And when our forefathers was here, that's why when Columbus came over here, our forefathers guided those ships and were able to translate in the Aramaic or the Arabic.
Mm.
Because there are some indigenous populations who were speaking in the Arabic, and it's historical documentation that supports that when a lot of the slave revolts happened, some of the indigenous populations were able to communicate with the ones who were brought over. And then, thinking that they're putting these group of people together from different areas and thinking that they don't have any way to communicate when, but that was looked down upon. That's why you'll see new languages spring forth as a result of the colonial thought, but some held on to their traditions. That's why you'll hear about the Maroons was sticking to it. Like, no, we're not dealing with any of that. We staying away
Right.
from
Right.
all of the European colonial. They try to modernize it. No, staying away from it because, and that's the same way in the Louisiana territory, where you have a people who, when they look at America, they'll look at it from a perspective that our forefathers were already here, and we didn't come over here on any ships when we knew we were here.
Mm.
But our people already globalized the world prior to European exploration and Manifest Destiny and Spanish Inquisition. And that's why when you study people like Toussaint L'Ouverture, and I'm glad you brought that up, because his thought to rebel is a result of seeing others rebel and seeing the situation that we're dealing with allowed his people to come together and galvanize and organize themselves, which a lot of our people to this day look down on organizing itself. Some don't, but some do because with organization comes unity. Now, right where we see any political nationalist movement all over the world started off through organizations, and they were incorporated within the colonial powers if they didn't kill them. That's
Mhm.
like with the Haitian Revolution, it was just like, no, we got our own government. Matter of fact, we don't even know who they are,
Mhm.
and we're gonna and then that's where you have these different concepts like you'll hear about dreadlocks,
Mhm.
and then people thinking that's coming from Jamaica, when really that was a concept from the Haitian Revolution that the word got to the British like, yo, the French dreaded seeing those,
Mm.
even though it's British term, but they dreaded seeing those locks
Mhm.
because they knew what happened in Asian. They was wearing them same locks,
Right.
the
Right.
ones who was taking them out.
Right.
And that's why they still to this day, even if you've seen what happened in Haiti and after the earthquakes, and all that money was being poured in. Now through colonial thought and European exploitation in the thought pattern, now they don't even need to have control of your nation. They just have our own people thinking a certain way where it's gonna be unjust.
Mm-hmm.
And that's my perspective on that.
All right. Mr. Martin, thanks, man. Martin Stansel Ills.
I appreciate it, brother. I appreciate you, brother Ferguson. It's always a blessing to come amongst you and unfold.
Yes, yes.
Definitely a blessing and honor to be able to share definitely about this origins of the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism. I'm really into this stuff, and it's interesting when Black History Month, where I feel like we really gotta stick with going back into antiquity sometimes, and then making connections with contemporary stuff, but really taking it back, because our forefathers was doing great, mighty things way before, slavery.
Yeah. Yes. So true, man. But listen, thanks again, and we'll try and see if we can make a part 2 of this, man, in the future. We got time. We'll talk off here and we'll see if we can, kind of dive deeper into some other things. This is some really deep historical stuff here that I'm learning as you're talking. So that's why I know you're the man, because I know you're a historian.
Now I'm learning too, because I'm, you're gonna have me do some research and come back, and it really allows me to freshen up, because sometimes you don't get to talk to people about certain things and thoughts and ideas that from back in the past. And they say it's boring. I don't want to hear that. All right, brother.
Tell you what, man, this is the year, and this is the month. We're gonna make it known to everybody. All right, history is deep, and history can tell you a lot. All right, so from now on, everybody, and see you next time for Barbershop Talk. Take care.